Welcome everyone to Ecology Live. I'm Jane Hill, Chair of the Publications Committee at the British Ecological Society. If this is your first time joining us, you're very welcome, and welcome back to all Ecology Live regulars. Thanks to NHBS who are sponsoring today's lecture. They supply equipment and books for ecologists and conservation professionals, and they have now extended their offer of free European shipping for Ecology Live viewers until the end of August. There'll be details at the end of the talk. If you're enjoying these Ecology Live talks, why not find out what else the British Ecological Society is doing? The best way to do that is sign up to our newsletter at www.britishecological.society.org/subscribe. We'll send you the latest research news, events and opportunities every 2 weeks. I'll shortly hand over to our speaker, Jesamine Bartlett, who's giving today's seminar. But let me first quickly say that we are recording the talk and will post the video to YouTube. There'll be a short question and answer session at the end of the 25-minute talk for those watching live. Please do submit your questions during the talk using the Q&A box. There's no need to wait until the end of the talk, and they can be named or anonymous, you can select. We'll then pick a couple of questions to ask our speaker at the end of the session and see how many we can get through. So without waiting any longer, let me introduce today's speaker, Jesamine Bartlett, whose talk, Invasions of a Polar Kind, will discuss biosecurity and the impacts of invasive species in the Arctic and Antarctic. So Jesamine, over to you.
Right, let's get going. Right, so I'm Jess Bartlett from the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, that's NINA, based in Trondheim, Norway. And today I present to you Invasions of a Polar Kind. Starring myself, several example invasive species, a good chunk of my PhD, and a cast of very helpful prompt characters throughout. Yes, Barbara, but not that kind of alien, more like this kind of alien. Pretty ordinary looking critters and plants, but don't be fooled by their lack of flying saucers. Invasive species are second only to climate change in the havoc they cause in ecosystems, and are responsible for a significant amount of native biodiversity loss. Where climate change and invasive species meet, the impacts may be disastrous for local biology, and this is particularly true in the Arctic and the Antarctic, where habitats are already hugely vulnerable to climate change. And with increasing human movement, the threat of alien species is cause for great concern, because when the aliens we speak of are earthbound species, it is us humans who are the spaceships moving them from place to place. So Antarctica is the largest wilderness on Earth. It's the most isolated and extreme continent on the planet. And at the base of the globe, the island continent is 360 degrees surrounded by ocean, physically distanced from other land masses, which makes it the least invaded continent on the planet. The southern polar vortex, a mass of swirling winds, and the circumpolar current further isolate it still, and humans are recent arrivals with no permanent habitation or indigenous peoples, and we didn't make landfall until the 1820s. But now we're visiting more than ever, and as we can cross the oceans and winds ourselves, so can anything that catches a ride with us. And not only are we visiting more than ever, but we are traveling around the continent more than ever too. In fact, can we really claim that Antarctica is still untouched? The truth is no. This very recent paper found that human activity has been extensive across Antarctica, but that still large areas have no visitation record at all, that's in purple. And they might still exist across central parts of the continent, these big wild spaces. But whilst it can still retain its crown of the largest wilderness on Earth, this is not an untouched land, especially in coastal areas that are ice-free and have most of the area's biodiversity, which is a problem. Antarctica is warming up in the very places we visit the most, making it more likely that alien species will prefer to stay. Essentially, what we see here in the darker colours are the higher risks of invasive species establishment in the future, both flora and fauna. At maximum capacity, there are less than 5,000 scientists in Antarctica at any one time. And for comparison, in 2018, Antarctica saw over 40,000 tourists visiting. 2019, that was nearly 56,000 tourists. And prior to the pandemic this year, we were expected to see nearly 80,000 tourists. And that would be a doubling in a decade. But tourists and researchers alike are predominantly visiting the Antarctic Peninsula, which has 77% of all tourist sites, 57% of all research stations, and most of Antarctica's biodiversity. And as we saw, it's also the fastest warming and therefore is the greatest risk of further alien species introductions and establishments. So far, 2 invasive plants have established in the Antarctic proper, both POA species, that's grasses. They're doubling the vascular plant population for the entire continent. Meanwhile, at least 9 invertebrates have established, all in the peninsula or the islands, and all via human pathways. So while surveys of tourists have found that many transport seeds and propagules on their boots and their clothing without realizing, both in the Arctic and the Antarctic, studies of cargo bound for Antarctica find hundreds of stowaways a year. In 2007, this winter cranefly, Trichothera maculopennis, caught a ride with the Uruguayans in their cargo. This fly took up residence in their sewage system, of all places. It was warm and cozy, I guess. And on the island of King George on the Antarctic Peninsula, it has since spread to all the research stations on the island and is doing very well, in part because of the existing presence of human infrastructure that can support it, but also because it is a cosmopolitan species, also found at high latitudes in the Arctic. So being at the same latitude in the south is not a problem for it, and it continues to fly around happily. The physiology of an invasive species like this is really crucial to determining its success, particularly its cold tolerance and ability to overwinter. And this is never more true than for someone or something trying to establish in the polar regions. So a species that can't invade polar regions, at least right now, is the mosquito Aedes albopictus. It's invasive to the UK and much of Europe, but because it has few pre-adaptations and an obligate life cycle that's dependent on warmer temperatures, its expansion as an invasive species is reliant on a warming climate. It hasn't packed enough pre-adaptations to invade the UK right now, let alone somewhere like the poles. It's fair-weathered, and as you see, it has the physiological equivalent of a bikini and a hat. Even if it were to hitch a ride with us, it would not survive. It's the cosmopolitan and wide-ranging species like the winter cranefly that are the ones to watch. So let's take a deep dive into Antarctica's most persistent invasive species. This midge, no, not that kind of midge. This is not a blood-sucking midge. This is a chironomid, Eretmoptera murphyi, who does not bite, and in fact, without a spaceship, it wouldn't even fly, yet. This is packed for sun, sea, and snow. It has a suite of pre-adaptations, physiological capabilities, and a flexible life history to allow it to colonize even the Antarctic continent, if it were to get there. It's a detritivore, so it lives in moss and peat banks, where it spends its 2 years as larvae consuming dead organic matter and fungi. It has adaptations that have made it a really successful invader to the Antarctic island of Signy. So the midge was introduced from the sub-Antarctic South Georgia at 54 degrees south. From there to the Antarctic island of Signy, which is just below 60 degrees. It doesn't seem like much distance to you, but Signy is much colder and harsher, with annual sea ice surrounding the island every winter, and average summer temperatures of just 4 degrees, which are combined with frequent freeze and thaw cycles, so it's a pretty rough place to live. But this midge thrives here because of its cold tolerance, which allows it to survive freezing to -19 in a supercooled state, whilst it can also withstand short periods of nearly +40 degrees Celsius. And furthermore, despite being terrestrial, I promise you it is terrestrial, it can respire in water. And we recently found it can even survive up to 3 weeks in seawater, potentially drifting in ocean currents. So as far as physiology goes, it is packing. So in a recently published study, we investigated just the overwintering physiology of this species further. And what you need to know about this hectic chart is that the red line is the soil temperature in sites occupied by the midge. So going through the winter season, and that the midge freezes here, but it doesn't die, or at least the population isn't really affected by that until here. But temperatures reach here. So how is it that it's thriving when temperatures are below their apparent cold tolerance? So a previous study some years ago found that the midge has the ability to rapidly cold harden, and it acclimates very quickly to decreasing temperatures, in some instances lowering its tolerance limit by several degrees after just a few hours. At the same time, winter temperatures were thought to be warmer in the soils than we actually find here, and the ability to rapidly cold harden was considered an extraneous bit of physiological luggage, but they didn't think it was necessary. And now we know that, much like my fourth pair of holiday shoes, it's actually essential, and is the ability of the species' success as a polar invader. Essentially, winter temperatures are not going low enough to kill this population, and we now know that it can happily colonize even further south onto the ice-free areas of the Antarctic continent. But right now, it's still on Cygney Island. This map shows you the spread through time since Arctic murphy was found in the 1980s, to the results of a more detailed distribution survey we did a couple of years ago. The original introduction site is marked with an X, and radiating increases in distribution. So in 2007, which was the last survey done before mine, the distribution covered an area of 35,000 meters squared, which is the orange disk. Now we find that it's increased to 85,000 meters squared in red, which is really impressive for a flightless organism with an active season of a couple of months. And most of that it spends as larvae. So in places we find there are as many as 100,000 individual larvae in a meter squared. And as several trails from the research base move straight through this habitat, we find that we're inadvertently spreading them around ourselves on the treads of our boots. So using some Maxent modeling, we thought we'd try and forecast how it's going to spread over the island in time if we do nothing. We find that several areas of Cygney Island are likely to be colonized, and this map shows the current areas of distribution in black, which I'll just get a pointer and highlight for you. Here we go. So this is where we know it is right now. And then we've spot surveyed over the rest of the island to prove its absence also. And then combined with the survey of its overall habitat and knowing what we know about habitat preference, amongst other things, we find that it's likely to spread to several different areas, with hotter colors denoting higher risk of future establishment. So it's going to colonize the entire peninsula here, move into new valley systems, is likely to move out to where there's a lot of penguin research done as well. But what was particularly concerning is these large areas of what are essentially pristine Southern Ocean moss banks and some of the best examples in the whole Antarctic region, so much so that they're being considered a site of special scientific interest. A colonization event here could affect these delicate ecosystems. So in time, yes, they probably will take over most of the island. And that's an excellent question, Daphne. So let's get into it. What does happen to the ecosystem once these guys colonize? So Cygney Island is typical of most polar and alpine systems in that it is simple and nutrient limited. Its terrestrial system looks a little bit like this, and the introduction of E. murphy has made it the largest terrestrial organism on the island and the only macro insect, with the rest of the ecosystem made up of some mites and springtails, tardigrades, rotifers, and nematodes, with some fungi and bacteria. The vegetation is basic and really dominated by cushion mosses and algae. There are just 2 vascular plant species on the island, the only 2 found in Antarctica. And away from wildlife colonies, nutrient levels are very low, more like crud on a pavement than any compost. So any changes to this may upset the native plant life who are adapted to these low nutrients. And this midge is a major detritivore in an ecosystem that has never known anything like it. It's doing the job of earthworms. It's never known earthworms. Previous studies have suggested that it's significantly increasing litter turnover in these moss banks. So much like the worms, it could also be making the ground more fertile and maybe appealing to other alien species that could get dropped off, whether that's flora or fauna. So the last paper from my PhD that we're preparing now will be on the ecological impacts of this species. So amongst several factors, one of the things we investigated was soil nitrogens, namely ammonia and nitrates, nitrites, the latter of which is particularly beneficial to any vascular plants, whether that be native or non-native. So we assessed wildlife colonies around the island, as well as other pristine moss banks and some just general control data without the midge in them, to get some baseline information on the scale of Arctic murphy nitrate deposition. So what we're seeing here is the total nitrogen levels for the whole island. And if we start breaking it down and looking just at the ammonias, we see higher areas associated with birds and penguins and some of the seals as well. which is pretty much expected. They have a lot of urea content, but we see little ammonia coming from the midge sites. And then when we move on and look at the nitrates and nitrites, this is when we start to see a real signal coming through from Ecmoptera murphyi. And in fact, what we find overall is that the midge is increasing nitrate levels by 3 to 5 times the background levels measured in control sites. And as a population, remember it can be as dense as 100,000 in a metre squared, it's affecting biogeochemistry as much as wildlife colonies, notably the largest animals on the island, the seals. So from core and moss bank evaluation, our results also found that there is a strong association with increased midge density and humus soils, but also a negative relationship with substrate depth. And what we think is happening is that the midge is turning over the litter faster, a process that normally takes a long time. Whoops. Normally takes a long time, and in cold and semi-frozen environments like Antarctica, it's turning that slowly decaying moss into a more nutrient-rich soil. So as these mosses have a larger volume than, say, humusy soil or more composty type soils, the substrate depth and thus the moss banks are actually decreasing in size, decreasing in depth. And this is significant when we think of its dispersal potential. If it's to colonize these areas of special scientific interest, it could change the fertility of the substrates and potentially affect the unique and rare vegetation community. The Antarctic pearl and Antarctic hairgrass are the only 2 vascular plants in Antarctica, and they occur here on Cygne in these locations. An increase in soil nitrogens could affect them and likely encourage the growth of the grass, and over time resulting in it outcompeting local mosses for which the island is renowned, on top of the potentially detrimental effects that the moss banks themselves will experience through the midge actually eating them. Furthermore, increasing soil fertility around the research station where the midge actually is right now is priming the soil for any stray seeds or propagules carried in what could have otherwise been a really inhospitable place for them. So now we understand the midge a little more, understand its ability to spread and also affect significant ecological change. It's evidently a potent invader. So it's time to check to see if the biosecurity measures against its spread from the island actually work. We've now established that it's strongly associated with human movement, and we likely move it around on the treads of our boots, and boot washes are the only biosecurity measure that are used before you enter the island and also before you leave. They consist of a brief Virkon boot wash at the permitted 1% dilution. Virkon's that pink disinfectant that you see on farms quite a lot. But we don't know if it's actually going to stop the spread of this midge if implemented for use either as you travel around the island or prevent it from being transferred off the island. In short, we tested this and no, it doesn't work. In a recently accepted article, we looked at these boot wash protocols and we found that Virkon at a 10-second exposure, using that as a proxy for a boot wash, at a 1% dilution does nothing to the midge. In fact, only after the best part of a day soaking it at 1% do you get anything close to 50% mortality, which is what you're seeing in this graph here. Even a 10% dilution will take 5 hours of soaking before any practical effect is seen. And this is a problem, as disinfectants and pesticides understandably really regulated in Antarctica, and 1% is the only permitted dilution for use. So whilst Virkon is great for microbes and viruses, it's really bad for insect control. So is it indestructible? Can anything stop it? Sorry, that got a bit dark, but it turns out that a simple hot wash of really just putting the kettle on might actually be the measure that we need. Because this midge has a scarily high heat tolerance, as we mentioned earlier, we thought we'd monitor its recovery after exposure to a hot boot wash simulation. So what you're seeing here is an exposure and then survival essentially for up to 3 days afterwards. And we find that after 10 seconds, so just a small dip of the boot essentially, at 50 degrees Celsius, we can kill off any residual larvae that may be stuck to people's boots. But if you go to 45 degrees, they can recover. Even if you think it's worked, they essentially resurrect again like zombies. So now we're recommending a dual approach to biosecurity, both around the island and coming off and on again from the island. We recommend a hot wash scrub of at least 50 degrees Celsius, followed by the Virkon microbial cleanse afterwards. So Let's move north and take a look at the Arctic, where we'll switch focus from alien insects to alien plants. Unlike the Antarctic, the Arctic is surrounded by land and ocean currents, and the jet stream do not form such a strong natural barrier. Furthermore, it has a long history of human habitation going back millennia, and the communities in the Arctic hold 4 million people, all moving around like spaceships, all transporting alien propagules and potential invasive species. Not to mention, there are hundreds of thousands of tourists who visit every year. My current research is based in the Arctic archipelago of Svalbard. There are 4 main settlements here: New-Ålesund, Pyramiden and Barentsburg, with the main town of Longyearbyen, which has 3,000 permanent residents. We see about 7,000 tourists entering through Longyearbyen alone, and if you remember, we had 50,000 for the whole of the Antarctic continent, so it's pretty intense. But in the last 10 years, there's been an increase of 54% in cruise passengers, and lately many millions of pounds have been invested in Svalbard as a tourist destination. But people don't just visit the main 4 settlements, and in 2018, over 180 onshore locations were visited also. So in order to see if we're taking any alien species to these sites outside of settlements, as well as the scale of establishment within settlements, myself and colleagues surveyed areas in Svalbard along with several of the most popular other sites, namely bird cliffs that get a lot of visitors for research or wildlife tourism. These cliffs also have nutrient-rich ground from the bird guano that would facilitate any seed establishment. And as we remember from earlier, nutrient addition from any animals is the major source of fertilization in polar sites. So these are primed for aliens hitching a ride with any unsuspecting tourist. We found 36 different alien species. They are currently within settlements only, and good news, nothing on the bird cliffs, but we were shocked by the amount of Taraxacum rudelia, so dandelions, that we see, and they were the most prolific species by an order of magnitude, and pretty much largely as a result of their pre-adaptive traits, flexible life histories. Several other species were pretty abundant too, including Poa pratensis, which is one of the only 2 invasive species ever to be established in Antarctica as well. In fact, we could claim that with similar environmental conditions, Svalbard is the Antarctic peninsula of the future if biosecurity does not improve in line with increasing human visitation. But what we're seeing in Svalbard just goes to show what can happen if these things go unchecked. We're seeing the tundra turn to weedy yellow meadows. When we look at the spatial distribution of the species, we see why. As an example, this is Barentsburg, which, contrary to my figure design choices, is not radioactive. But here, the hotter colours show a higher density of alien species. We see 2 main clusters, one in the north next to an old farm where many species were imported in hay for animals that have since long gone. And in town, we see several clusters. If we zoom in, we can see why. I'll just get my laser pointer back for you to show you. So once we map over with a nice Google screenshot here, we can see the route taken by tourists, essentially mapped through the diversity in alien species. People are getting off the ship here, and they're going to the gift store here. They're popping to the church. They may be swinging by to see Lenin, canteen, and then they're going down the road to the pub. So as Arctic tourism increases, pandemic pending, institutes like mine have realized that we need to better educate visitors, whether they're tourists or scientists, on potential alien hitchhikers. So Nina, in conjunction with several other partners and the governor of Svalbard, have created the Stop Arctic Aliens campaign, where posters and animations are shown at key Arctic gateways and as videos on flights to Longyearbyen. But whilst Antarctica does have operator recommendations, it has no such widespread public awareness initiative, despite the tourists booking up faster than ever, even in the pandemic. You're right, we must do something, but don't panic. Early career researchers are onto it. In fact, for the first time in public, I would like to introduce to you Polar Alien Hunters. We are an early career research-led initiative who are creating educational materials for visitors traveling south, for tour operators, national science programs, and we are invasive species researchers, science communicators, educators, and part of our objective is going to be lobbying policymakers for mandatory and universal biosecurity practices in Antarctica. We are Arlie McCarthy, who's Antarctic marine invasives researcher, myself, Arctic and Antarctic terrestrial invasive species, Christy Herrier, who is a psychologist specializing in environmental psychology and behavior change for polar tourism, and Alice Pullen, who is our wonderful illustrator and whose work you've been seeing popping up throughout the talk so far. Focused around our comics, we're going to highlight the risks of invasive species and demonstrate how to prepare for visiting Antarctica through engaging and hopefully memorable formats. We'll provide steps to increase biosecurity and personal responsibility for any visitors, and we'll be developing materials for several national operators, providing materials for smaller firms and nations who do not have the facilities to develop their own educational materials. All of our materials will be available online at polaralienhunters.com. And also on social media. We're on Twitter at Polar Aliens, and you can use any hashtags to get our attention too. We aim to be an essential service for any person or organisation travelling to Antarctica, as well as eventually a one-stop shop for all invasions of a polar kind. So with that, I'd like to say that wherever you go, but especially when you're visiting remote polar regions, please let's not be spaceships. Don't pack an alien. Thank you very much for your attention.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jesamine. So we've had a lot of questions have come in, so I'm going to ask you some of those. One of the common questions that several people have asked, including Dr. Stedden and Sylvia Choisu, is about asking about other ways in which invasive species might arrive on the island. So Sylvia, for instance, asks, could the midge also spread without the help of humans, for example, on the wind or from bird flight?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And it's something that has been explored a little in the past. Wind, so someone has investigated wind trajectory and velocity with this midge and found that it doesn't explain its distribution pattern at all, really. However, one thing that we think might be significant, especially in the future, once the population reaches critical capacity along the very immediate shoreline, is we know it can survive in the sea. And if it gets stuck to a seal fur, or the fur seals clamber all over these banks, we're pretty sure that it could be spread around that way, or at least moved into the oceans and dispersed. So whilst kind of like epi or endozootic isn't a major concern, if it does get into the ocean by any means, it can actually drift. And one of its closest relatives does do this on the Antarctic Peninsula, and we think that it can do it too.
Okay, no, that's great. And there's a really good question again that several people have asked. Anonymous question. Is there anything that can be done to control or to reduce the already established populations of midges?
Yeah, it's a question that I get asked a lot, and unfortunately not. It's so widespread in the moss banks now. It's been there for, oh my goodness, we think it was established in the 1960s. You'd end up absolutely decimating the native vegetation in order to kill it. And the mosses and the plants that do occur are so precious that's just not a step or an example that the British Antarctic Survey wants to take. So it is just a case of managing where it is and trying to prevent it from getting anywhere else, because once it's there, it's very hard. It's much easier to eradicate plants because you can see exactly where they are and pull them up by their roots. But this midge, unfortunately not.
And following up from that comment, there's a great question here from Joseph, which says, it seems like the midge spread on Antarctica could actually increase biodiversity down there. So is it necessarily something that we want to avoid?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. And especially when you look at the physiological results of what happens with the native grass, the Champsia Antarctica, it loves any extra nitrogen that it can get. And you'd think that that would be really beneficial for it. And it would help it spread, it would make it less rare, but it would be at the detriment to arguably equally as precious, but they don't flower, so nobody's interested in them, with the moss banks, which are really very scientifically interesting. But unfortunately, what you do tend to see when you have these changes in fertility is not necessarily a long-term positive effect for native species, because the moment you get something like one of the Poa annuas or Poa pratensis, which are invasive, then they will outcompete any native flora. And that's what we would like to prevent ideally. It would be nice to think that it would increase native biodiversity, but realistically, unless we all stop travel immediately, it's not going to happen.
That's great. And then a final talk, Jess, from Danica Drury, who asks, they're curious to know if there's any work on marine invasive species in the polar regions, either due to transporting ballast water or from warming waters.
Yes, there is. In fact, my co-founder for Polar Alien Hunters, Ali McCarthy, she is a marine invasive specialist. She looks at what gets moved around on ships. So ballast water is one concern. Encroaching warming waters are also something else. So the king crab has made its way to Antarctica, and it is essentially like the example I gave you for Aedes albopictus, the mosquito. It is following that warming front, and the closer that warming front gets to the Antarctic coastline, the more damage it's going to do to native biodiversity. But if you're interested in the marine stuff, definitely look up Ali on Twitter.
Okay, thanks so much, Jess. So that brings today's Ecology Live to a close. So thanks so much to Jesamine, and thank you to everyone for joining the talk online. So next week at the same time, we'll have Alan Knapp from Colorado State University, who will be giving his talk on the ecological paradox of the Dust Bowl drought. The past can inform the future. So that's another talk not to be missed. And here's a reminder that you can catch up on all Ecology Live talks on our YouTube channel. We've had a whole top set of ecologists speaking so far, so do make sure to hit the red subscribe button and click like. And finally, I'll leave you with details of the offer from the sponsors of today's Ecology Live talk, NHBS, so you can take full advantage. And see you again next Thursday.